As we begin our tribute to Dr. Candace Pert, we would like to welcome Dr. Michael Ruff, her husband, who will talk about the legacy of Dr. Candace Pert beyond the molecules of emotions. Dr. Michael Ruff, he received his Bachelor of Science in Biophysics from the Johns Hopkins University, his PhD from the Department of Immunology and Microbiology, University of Florida Medical School, followed by his postdoctoral virology research as a senior fellow at the Institute for Immunology and University of Zurich, and at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, National Cancer Institute, NIH. He has collaborated with Dr. Candace Pert to identify unifying pathways that might unite neuroscience with immunology to create a biochemistry of mind-body medicine. Please welcome Dr. Michael Ruff.
Oh, success. Isn't that nice? It's a treat for me to be here. It's an honor to be here. It's the first time I'm meeting this organization, and I thank Dr. Sonia Doi for thinking of me to invite me. I know she was interested that Candace would talk, and she contacted me, and it's an honor to be in front of this group of people, and I'm just kind of blown away by the introductory comments, the introductory video. It's just amazing to me, the work of this organization, and so I congratulate you. And it seems to me quite novel, quite advanced, and quite leading edge on this topic of bringing forward a new medicine, which is where I started with my wife, Candace, many years ago. I'd come to the NIH as a postdoctoral fellow. I was an immunologist and a virologist by training. Candace was already a famous neuroscientist. I was interested in meeting her, which I did quite by chance at the campus bar. And I was kind of the shy, quiet guy, but Candace in due course spoke to everybody in the place and eventually got around to me. And, figured out I was an immunologist, and I was a little bit interested in the brain, and we started this dialogue and a collaboration that lasted 30 years until she passed away about a year ago this month. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Candace, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the progression of our thinking, our work together, and maybe what she had contributed to this field of effort. I think very early on we kind of realized, or Candace realized, I realized, we were working at the NIH, and so of course we were working in the reductionist model. Everything was to get down to the deepest molecular level. And we kind of thought, well, that's not really where the answer is going to be. Descartes was the one that threw out spirit and said, well, the church and religion can have spirit, but medicine will deal with the body. And that was the progression of medicine, and that was the paradigm in which modern science was operating in, considered to be a space of pure rational endeavor, devoid of emotions, feelings, psyche, mind, spirit. And this is the landscape that we were operating in because we were at the NIH, and the NIH is the citadel of American science, and of course in some way that makes it the palace of science in the world. And when Candace wrote her book, Molecules of Emotion, she called it the palace, but she called it the palace in a mocking way because she was thinking of Versailles, and so she was laughing at them and thinking, well, they didn't quite get it. So who's working the slides? So on this first slide, thank you for being here. I'm not Candace. I'm going to try to pull some information from some talks she gave. One of the last talks that she gave before she died, she was actually considering this topic of mind and spirit beyond death. And so she opened her talk with this quote from Hamlet. and Shakespeare, which you're all familiar with. For in that sleep of death, who knows what dreams may come? And she thought these existed in the body, and she thought that these existed outside of the body. So to start at the beginning, here's Candace. She's 26 years old. She came to Johns Hopkins University as a graduate student. At that time, the Department of Pharmacology was just being formed. This was in the era of sort of like there weren't any psychiatric drugs really, and the notion of this Department of Pharmacology was that they were going to create drugs to treat a brain disease. And so this is her professor, Dr. Saul Snyder. And Candace was stimulated by the notion of like the opiate receptor. At that time, receptors hadn't really been well characterized. And as Candace's personality, as Candace's nature was, she demanded that she work on the opiate receptor project, which hadn't been done. And she was laboring away on this for a long, long time without much success. And a professor pulled her off the project and said, that's it, it's over, you got to get your PhD, this is bogged down, we're not making any progress, I'm moving you on to something else. She disobeyed that instruction, as she disobeyed nearly all instructions in her life. And she decided to proceed, and he went off to a meeting in the summer, and she spent $2,000 of the laboratory budget to order something, which was a big slug of dough. And she ran the experiments, and they hit. And the work was published in Science, and it exploded in the world because it captured everybody's imagination. Here was the opiate receptor, and for Candace, here was this first emotional receptor of the brain that was discovered. And now the methodology that she developed created the tools by which other drugs could be tested and discovered. So in some ways, Candace really launched the field of psychopharmacology, because there wasn't any discipline by which to test and discover drugs in the brain, except that Candace brought the methodology forward. And once that existed, then it was possible for drug companies and everyone else to move into the field, which later in life she was horrified by, because it came medicalization of all sorts of emotional, spiritual diseases that would be treated, and even in the public school systems in counties like Montgomery County, half the kids are taking psychotropic medications, which she would say, well, the only reason they have this is a result of my work, but I think this is a travesty and a corruption. Candace was a great artist. These are some drawings that she made. Here she's kind of early on. This is like early. This work, she was 26 years old, took place in 1973. Her boss got the Lasker Prize, which is the top prize in American science. Candace was kind of excluded. It went to 3 guys. And she refused to go to the Lasker Award benefit banquet, and that created like a huge uproar in the field of science. It was covered in Science Magazine, Nature, it's like big newspapers, controversy erupts at the Lasker Prize, because Candace refused to go along with it. Her boss wanted her to stand up and just sort of like be trotted out as the kind of like technical junior girl, and Candace had written something that then got forwarded and published in Science that was something along this quote, about people like low in the scientific hierarchy being excluded. And by that she meant women in science and people lower in the scientific hierarchy. So Candace was very outspoken, but she was also a great champion of women. She was a great champion of women in science, great champion of professional women. She'd bring women scientists into her laboratories. From this graduate position, she headed up a laboratory at the National Institutes of Health, where she worked for most of her adult life until we formed our business and our research companies and laboratories together. This is more of her arty work. These are opiate receptors in a brain slice. This is the hippocampus, which is a site of memory and learning formation. And so some of her early work said, learning and memory formation, this part of the brain is highly decorated, highly enriched in opiate receptors, and therefore she thought opiate receptors would have some control, some kind of function on this. And she's attempting to bridge. At this point, we're still thinking about the brain. There's like chemistry, but she's got this little rainbow motif. So she's already starting to think that there's something beyond in this illustration of hers. Most psychologists treat the mind as disembodied, a phenomenon with little or no connection to the physical body. Conversely, physicians treat the body with no regard to the mind or the emotions. But the body and the mind are not separate, and we cannot treat one without the other. So this is a theme that's been echoed many times already in this morning's presentation. And so Candace, it's a quote from her book, and Candace had kind of realized that. And as we started working together, it was kind of, well, I'm the immunologist, she's the neuroscientist, and I posed a question to her, do you think the brain has any effect on the immune system? That was like the naive question when I first came to the NIH around 1984, 85, and we started discussing this. And then we started thinking about, well, how this might work. And the culmination, I think, is I view this as really a landmark publication in the Journal of Immunology, in which Candace talks about neuropeptides and their receptors as a psychosomatic network. And here she is, she's working in her laboratory, about maybe the height of her powers at the NIH, with her large research budget. We're working on this, and this is an illustration kind of typical of the time to give you a sense of where we were around 1985. So, we've got the glands, the organs, the tissues, we've got the nervous system over here, maybe this is the endocrine structural system, but these are static images, and at that time we were still looking for pathways and mechanisms of communication and integration in this. But she started to talk about psychosomatic network and how this could work. A lot of this is covered in her book, which is out in the lobby. It's been in press. It's a popular book. It's a teaching book. Colleges use it. She wrote articles in Smithsonian Magazine, The Matter of Consciousness. And one of her key concepts, which I'll talk about in a minute or so, is your body is your subconscious mind. I think she was the first to articulate this, and it's kind of caught on in a way it's almost now well integrated in the popular zeitgeist. People talk about this. This is an image from that publication, Neuropeptides and the Receptors, a Psychosomatic Network. So this is 1985. This is a paper that was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2014. So quite a spread of years, some 30 years or so. And so what I thought is Candace had developed maps of the body-mind. And these guys are also talking about maps of the body-mind. So they had looked at large numbers of individuals, multicultural, of course, different cultures, different populations, different races, and asked people, where do you feel anger, where do you feel fear, where do you feel happiness, and things like this. And then they kind of like recorded this, documented this from thousands and thousands of people which they were interviewing. And there was a commonality, a convergence of how people were expressing or experiencing these things. Happiness up in the chest, the head, fear, sort of like clenched feeling. And I thought that was very interesting, and I put that up against Candace's maps because she was interested in these emotional molecules. And the opiates were clearly representative of a class of molecules which could induce some emotional expressivity. But she thought all emotions would be tied to expression of neuropeptides. And it comes from a bit of a biological literature. If you inject these compounds into the brain or into the body, they can induce behaviors, very typical types of behaviors. And so she started to think about these molecules as being the vehicles by which emotion could be expressed in the body, but also being systemically distributed. It was not in the brain, because as she studied this, these are opiate receptors in the brain and the striatum, but they're also present down in levels of the spinal cord. This is the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and there's lighting up with opiate receptors, and these are sensory pathways. The ventral part doesn't have any of these emotional expression molecules. That's the motor pathways. They're not really well controlled, but all of the sensory pathways pass through, and so from the neuroaxis all the way down. This is also a section to the brain. This is the amygdala, and the amygdala has been kind of recognized as a locus of emotional expressivity. So she was kind of the first to put a biochemistry behind this. This little nucleus down here is called the habenula. It's part of sexual arousal and so on. It's very rich in opiate receptors. But she could see this neuroaxis straight down. And my kind of contribution, I was like the immunologist, and so some of the early work that we were doing was showing that there were neuropeptide receptors on immune cells. And that was a big, like, what is that all about? The immunologists were like staggered, stunned. It didn't make any sense. But for Candace, it was like perfectly reasonable, because we wanted to talk about a medicine of the future, a new medicine of the future, a more integrative medicine of the future, a medicine that wasn't reductionist at its core, but a medicine that would be more integrative and whole. And at that time, there was big discussions, psychosomatic, psychoneuroimmunology, and so on. They were already like fighting about the names of the terms, and Candace would make jokes and say, scientists would rather use someone else's toothbrush than use someone else's nomenclature or terminology. It was almost at that level. But we started this work, and we were looking for what were the antecedents, what existed out there, and there really wasn't very much. There was Norman Cousins' book, Anatomy of Illness. George Solomon was a psychiatrist, University of California, was speculating on some of this. We had Walter Cannon, the turn of the century, Wisdom of the Body, but that was turn of the century. There just wasn't a lot of literature on this. About this time, 85, 86, Nick Cohen and Bob Ader, University of Pittsburgh, I think, started publishing some papers on conditioning of the immune response. I was a postdoc at that time, and I thought, oh, this is stunning. So there, my Department of Immunology and Microbiology at the National Institutes of Health, the Journal Club, I presented this paper, and it was like stunned silence. And I was like, nobody gets it? Nobody gets it? I mean, if there's conditioning of the immune system, then everything was like, well, you could create an immune system by taking immune cells and putting them in a dish. That was immunology, and that was how immunology was studied. Do you make antibodies? Do you not make antibodies? Do you kill tumor cells? Do you not kill tumor cells? But here's conditioning, which was like whether you had an immune response or not was a function of a mental brain process. And that was Ader and Cohen. And that just stunned me, and I thought that was a great paper, and we knew this is it, we're on to it. And it was, all right, what are the pathways, what are the mechanisms, how does all of this work? So every neuropeptide, every kind of peptide receptor that you could think of was distributed in the brain. So they're in different locations. These are neurotensin receptors. They're like in different spots. And then we started looking at some of what would be considered the classical immune types of hormones, these cytokines and interleukins and things like this. And so there's a whole series of papers that Candace has published showing interleukin-1 in the brain. Oh, interleukin-1 was supposed to be an immune cell. Oh, what's it doing in the brain? And so we started to develop this notion of, well, this was the pathway by which the integrated whole would occur. Emotions, an expression of emotions. Candace was a very emotional person. I don't know if anybody had a chance to meet Candace, but if Candace was in this room, she would pretty much fill the space, and you would know that she was in the room. And she would talk to every one of you by the time it was over, and you would go, wow, what a gal. And that was Candace. So Candace was very emotional and voluble, so it was like perfect for her, the opiate receptors. She fell off a horse as a young girl. She like kind of crushed her vertebra, and she was giving opiates for the first time, and she was like, wow, this is pretty wild, and that kind of like launched her onto this discovery to understand, what is this feeling that comes along with this. So the idea of this slide is we create our own reality, which I kind of like. It like goes back to Kant. Like there is not an objective, independent reality. The reality is our reality. And the way she thought this happened was, information was flowing through the neuroaxis, and the mind is not primal in this system anymore. Candace conceptualized it as a system of information flow. And so it would start in the brain and then go down through the spinal cord into the body, into the immune system, and back up away. So it was, it's like kind of like bi-directional. Another aspect of this system that we realized was it wasn't neurocentric, and it wasn't primarily mediated by neurons. I'm showing you a neuronal pathway here, but we recognized that a lot of these molecules were soluble molecules, and they get released and they act at a distance. They act in different places, and so they can flood the body. And this communication system, as we thought to discuss it and conceptualize it, was not a communication system that was mediated by nerves. It wasn't like nerve conduction, flexing your muscles or creating movement, that it was much more distributed than that. And at every level of the neuroaxis, Candace thought, well, information gets processed, and the key would be at these synapses. Candace understood information was stored at the synapses, and we know this from the work of Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize, and many, many other scientists and researchers. When there is a memory, there is a change in receptors. All right, they get phosphorylated, for those of you that love biochemistry. Or they get some modification, and in this way, memory, learnings, experience are preserved and protected. Later in the talk, I'll kind of get to how Candace started to think, well, it's even distributed further than that. But at this time, we're just talking about information and understanding that information gets filtered, it gets gated at these sensory pathways. This is the lower part of the brainstem right here. It's called the periaqueductal gray. It mediates breathing. And you know that breathing is a very powerful way to control pain, sensation, experience, and things like this. And how does it work? It works through these opiate receptors that are present, but lots of other peptide receptors are present in these sensory areas. Same sensory areas there. This is just lower down, this is higher up. There they are again. They're here, they're not there. And they're little gates and they're little filters. And so when you breathe, what you're doing is like you're controlling the information flow up and down through the body. So we have this network, and then we start to have other processes that can start to access a network that controls our sensory state. It controls what we may experience. And so in this way, we create our own reality. And so Candace said the emotions via the neuropeptides bridge learning, memory, and behaviors. We know behaviors because you can inject them into the brains of animals. And one of the most amazing, profound stories, I contributed part of it, she contributed part of it, but when we put it together, it was kind of crazy. So there's a hormone, LHRH, luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone. It causes the maturation of eggs in the ovaries. But if you inject this into the brain of a rat, female rat, they assume a lordotic position. That is a sexual position. So there's a behavior that's expressed by this. There is egg maturation that's expressed by this. So there's an emotion, there's a behavior. So we have memory behaviors. And this hormone is homologous in the humans. It's homologous to something that's called yeast alpha mating factor, which is present in yeast. So this hormone in yeast causes the yeast to form like the two forms, which then go on to divide. And here, it's been conserved in mammals and humans in very, very similar form to have kind of a related function, reproduction. Yeast, humans. So now you've got this conservation of behaviors through this chemical signaling system that goes way back. And, Candace studied some of this. She's published some papers on this. She would say anxiety. What's anxiety? Anxiety, benzodiazepines, the benzodiazepine receptor. She could study that. Anxiety is you have two choices. You can't decide the choice. It's kind of a higher function. She looked back and she said, you have to be at least a bony fish to have anxiety to be able to have benzodiazepine receptors. So evolutionary, she looked at these unicellular organisms. Bony fish had it, sponges and bacteria, and unicellular organisms didn't. So that's why she said, bony fish, you have anxiety. But the opiate receptors, she found opiate receptors on unicellular organisms, tetrahymena also. So this communication system has been preserved in animals. Darwin wrote a book called The Expression of the Emotions in the Animals, and so he recognized this, and he saw emotional expressivity as shared between animals and people. So this is a system that's evolutionarily conserved, and it shares similar functions, in these different organisms, which is to integrate behavior with learning and experience. So this is one of Candace's big sort of like joke lines. So I have to put this in. So I'm Candace, and I'm saying, all right, so how does all of this work? Well, here's the lady. She gets up in the morning. She reaches for a cup of coffee. It's hot, and she drops it. So she has this quick, fast nerve reflex to the spinal cord. It's hot. You drop it. All right, that's the nerve reaction. But it also percolates up through all of these different levels where the information is being processed and changed. And only when it gets up into her frontal cortex is it possible to assign like a meaning and a value to the experience that she just had. And at that point, she blames her husband. And that's the way Candace would see that. So these memories and learnings and this reality that we create, we are imposing it. We're imposing it by virtue of the information that's processed at every level of the neural axis. Each one of those synaptic transmissions can go through or not go through. They can be modulated. They can be changed. Vision's a great example, too. You ask people, what did you see? What did you see? What did you see? What did you see? We're all in the same room, but everybody tells a different story. So there's 7 synapses. The retina is not a camera. The retina doesn't take a picture of the world. There's 7 synapses from the retina to the back of your head to the visual cortex, and every one of those levels, the information gets processed and changed. And there's research studies that are done. They show people films. There's like a big distraction going on in one corner, and somebody runs naked across the frame. Teacher says, all right, what happened in this movie? And people tell, well, these 2 guys in the back got into a fight, and there was like tough. Did anybody see the naked person? There was no naked person running across the room. Show the movie again. And they go, oh my God. Okay? So you see what you expect to see. You experience what you expect to see, and you don't see or experience what you don't expect. So this creates a great possibility then. We have to break out of our preformed expectations of what things are and be open to a different reality of what may be. But this is all, our expectations are coded in this like neuroaxis system that Candace described. She talked about this, we talked about this as a network. And in a way, early 80s, cybernetics, network, all of this was kind of emerging out. And we said, well, okay, this has to be applicable to what we're talking about. So the key elements that we focused on, which we discussed in this publication, the network is to send and receive information. All right, fine, we got that. It communicates among the elements. So for us, it was all the elements of the brain and body, but later on I'm going to tell you, we start to realize this communication extends beyond the body, and I think that sort of dovetails in the interest of this group. At this point, we're not quite there yet. We're still a bit in the body, and we're still a bit brain, but we're moving into mind as this informational network. And part of it was that there was no fixed hierarchy. The brain isn't in control. Candace would say your body doesn't exist to carry your brain around. So there's no fixed hierarchy. And she would say, well, if you have teenage kids or teenage boys, you can understand that because sometimes the brain's not in control, sometimes the gonads are in control. And so depending on what the demands are on the body, it could shift the focus. And as we were thinking about this, I was thinking, yeah, disease, I'm faced with it. What happens? You get sick, you get a virus. It's like, okay, you get fever, interleukin levels go up. They control temperature processes. They control innate immune processes in the body, but they also control behavior because interleukin-1 acts in the brain at the sleep centers, makes you sleepy, so you lie down, which is you need to prioritize what your body is doing. You can't do all things at once. So you're sitting here and you're focused on me and that's your priority, but state of sickness or illness or something, other parts kind of take over and it's like you need to lie down, need to rest, take water, whatever. The focus kind of shifts. So this hierarchy can move around and different parts can be in control. So it's interesting to think about that. Why am I doing what I am doing? Ask yourself that question. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And as you get deeper into that, it kind of opens up a big Pandora's box in a way. Well, I'm not sure why exactly am I doing that? And a lot of times you think, well, I'm doing it because that's what I always do, or it's just some repetitive pattern that I do, and that may be adaptive, it may be maladaptive, maybe it doesn't serve you very well, but you've learned it and it's almost like a stimulus response and you're doing that and you say, well, maybe I want to break that pattern, maybe I want to shift out of that hierarchy, maybe I want to do something different, okay? And then that starts to be this element of conscious control that can reach down in there and reset some of the switches. So she was very interested in the emotions as the physiological mediators. I've already talked about how they arise early in evolution. Okay. They exist in the animals, Darwin talked about, and they organize the mind and the body. So, yeah, she loved this. This was a perfume ad, but there's this woman in this sort of, ecstatic, opiate, trance, seductive, kind of like behavior. The whole thing kind of like plays out in this image which is used to advertise a perfume. And we started to think that they exist beyond the body. And I think this gets to this organization. So the emotional system prioritizes the body's information to promote survival and wellness. The shared receptor exists in the brain and the body. She started to think mind doesn't exist in the brain, which is the comment earlier. Your body is your subconscious mind. So, if information is stored at synapses and if these emotional encoding systems are distributed throughout the brain and the body, if they're existing in the immune system, then mind must exist in the body. And so that was one of her big comments. There is no mind apart from the body. And you'll see her choice of word here, body-mind. So we're starting to get beyond the idea that there's a nervous system, an immune system, and an endocrine system that talks to one another. This is 1986, 87, 88, 9. I mean, this was kind of like the framework. This was the conceptualization, a revelation that the immune system would talk to the immune system. But if Candace uses the word body-mind, we realize that she's already gone quite beyond that, and she did it in 1986 in one of her publications. And she was already realizing that, mind was infused throughout the body, that, there was no body apart from the body-mind. And it wasn't like body-mind with a dash. They were really, let's pull these together. So she really wanted to break down and chip away at the Cartesian division that had existed for 300 years. She really wanted to throw that model out. And what it opened up was all of these alternative therapeutic modalities that were out there were efforts to treat, to heal. Because, as Dr. Doi said, we realize the limitations of modern medicine. You're reeled in, you're hooked up to the instruments and the machines. Where is the treatment of the whole person? Where is that occurring at George Washington University Medical School or at the NIH? Where is that occurring? And so there was kind of like this whole other group of healers who would touch people, energy healing, massage therapy, body work. This is all engaging this emotional system in an effort to bring forward a medicine of the future. And we talked about it. We called it the new medicine, and we realized that this would need to involve bringing in all of these other practices. And so when we talked about the network makes sense to us, because if someone's touching you, someone's wiggling your toe, that's an entree point into the whole system. We can't minimize that. And it's as valid as thinking that a process exists in your brain, because the process exists in your body too, and you could access it that way. And so our papers, our publications, and Candace's lectures started to provide, a lot of support for people who would say, you've been to your doctor, he's not really offering you a lot of relief, but I am. I am because I am considering your soul. I am considering your psychospirit. I'm considering what's happening in your life, and I'm treating that. And that's why you're able to have some recovery or improvement of your physical symptoms, some resolution of your disease processes. And we said, well, it's just as valid. So how could this be occurring? How could this be happening? And I showed the picture from the Alex Gray books, which I imagine you're familiar with. And so it illustrates a few things. One is these nodes of information processing. So, at the deep down molecular level, well, here's the opiate receptor and here's endorphin and it's operating at that level. And, here they are on a little more macro scale, at loci in the brain or in the spinal cord or in the immune system. And, she called these nodes of information processing, little clusters of information processing, and this would exert opiatergic turn. A different neuropeptide would have a different pattern, different location, but the same idea. And she thought that this was a manifestation of the chakra system, so this was an old system, Ayurvedic medicine, Eastern philosophies of these chakra systems working out through the body. And she thought these were information processing nodes too. State-dependent memory and learning is interesting. She said, this is from the work of Don Overton, emotions are like drugs. Emotions trigger memories, behaviors, postures, and bodies. All of this comes together. It's like if you're studying for the test, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, you got to take the test smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. That's state-dependent memory and learning. Emotions are encoded, memories are encoded in certain emotional states. We remember the things that are happy and positive, we tend to remember those. So our emotions are coded. And so you can access different emotional states to access different emotions. You may remember certain things in a certain emotional state. You're not going to remember them in a different emotional state. It comes from the physiological work of Don Overton. Emotions are like any drug. They may potentiate or hinder inflammation and healing. So Candace posed many questions. What are the root causes of disease? What are the roles of the emotions? How does healing become interrupted? This is Cannon's work, The Wisdom of the Body, but we saw that sometimes healing becomes interrupted. It just doesn't proceed. And we thought that these were like emotional blockages or spiritual blockages, and being able to break through emotional and spiritual blockages would allow the progression of physical healing. And so she was interested in touch, imagery, meditation, spirituality, body work. And she was also particularly interested in how this emotional network spilled out into other people. We will experience, I experience emotions in myself, but, if we're all laughing or, sharing a thought, we as a group are collectively experiencing, a state of mind, which, she's kind of getting at in this Alex Gray type of photograph, that this informational system didn't exist just in our body. Now she's seeing it. It starts to extend out to other people and so on. It's a little bit of like the excess healing, excess inflammation kills neurons. If you're angry, if you're inflamed, neurogenesis dies down. So true healing is post-inflammatory process. I could give an entire lecture on that, but she saw that you would be locked in emotional states, and being locked in an emotional state, you were also locked in a neurochemical state, and so you didn't have as much the range of adaptability, the range of flexibility. And so she thought a lot of healing, a lot of touch, a lot of spiritual intervention was to break up these emotional blockages. And so that every trauma has both a physical and an emotional component, right? So when you're coming in for your physician, they want to treat the physical part, but who's treating the emotional component? And both of these things need to be addressed in order to affect true healing. So we have this idea of interrupted healing being you're stuck in a dissociated state of mind. Your state of mind isn't well integrated with the rest of your body. So maybe you would talk to your patients, talk to your clients, find out what's going on and try to break through, these blockages as we would think of them. We yearn to be coherent and harmonious. Meditative and spiritual states create coherent brain waves associated with compassion and bliss. These coherency, it's all about having coherency. John Upledger has this idea of psychosomatic cysts, where something is like walled off. It's a very primitive defense mechanism where you just wall something off. But no, we want to open everything up and be coherent. And she thought spirituality was a very good way to get to this coherence. And we should seek coherence and integration among the body systems because it creates a unified, concerted action among the systems. Heterodynamic means it's optimally flexible and it's optimally adaptable. So on the topic of does consciousness survive death, Candace says, 1986, in this article, I posted it on our website. This is, I think, the first use of the term body-mind, no hyphen. I think it's possible to conceive of mind and consciousness as an emanation of emotional processing, and such mind and consciousness would appear to be independent of brain and body. And she thought that information that would be stored in the body-mind, that this information could transform itself into some other realm. The question that Candace was considering and didn't have really an answer was like, where does biologically sourced information go? Does it die when the body dies? She didn't think so. She thought it went out into this other realm. Perhaps it persists. And she also realized, well, this is a little gnarly, it's a little unclear. Western science doesn't really want to go there very much. The last project that she was working on just before she died was a book that she wrote with her friend Debbie Cruz. And in the end of her life, well, she didn't know it was going to be the end of her life, but in her late mature adult life, she was interested in bliss. And she would say we're hardwired for bliss. The neurophysiology exists, that we can exist in states of bliss. We're meant to exist in states of bliss. And what does it take to get to states of bliss? And this is what drove her to spiritual practice. Candace was open to all spiritual practice. She loved it. Anybody she would hang out with, whatever your belief, whatever your system, spiritual, she loved to get into that. And she thought this was the pathway to bliss. And this is what she writes about in her book. There's a few copies we brought along if you're interested in that. But she wanted to understand, what's the nature of bliss and how do we get it? And I just want to say, just in the closing minutes or so, I'll give you a little bit more about Candace. Candace is working on cures. It wasn't so much the mind-body stuff, but if you're aware of this movie, Dallas Buyers Club, it's about our AIDS drug, peptide T. It was a very early AIDS drug. It's non-toxic. It was talked about in this movie. And I think one of Candace's true legacy is, she was a neuropharmacologist and she was interested in creating medicines at lots of different levels. But the company that she and I formed some years ago, it's called Rapid Pharmaceuticals, and we're developing her drugs for HIV, for Alzheimer's, for autism, for MS. And for me, this is going to be her true legacy. These are great drugs. They're non-toxic. They're going to treat these diseases. They're going to cure them. And so that's why, for me, she's the most amazing. I don't know how I was lucky to spend my life with her, but to be able to do all of these things, to launch all of these different scientific disciplines, to create these drugs, which haven't been fully realized, where these drugs are in clinical trials, they're being studied. This is going to be where she's going to end up. This is her AIDS drug, just to show you. You come in, this is bad. You take her drug for 3 months, totally clears up your brain, and you do a lot better. I'm going to skip through a lot of this other stuff and just close out to leave you a little bit of a feeling of my wife, Candace, if you had met her. She was positive in outlook, belief, and action. She came down in the morning singing to her dogs. That's how she was. It's not to say she didn't get tired. It's not to say she didn't get bummed out. But for the most part of people I know, she was positive. She was caring and compassionate. She touched other people's lives. Lots of people wrote to me after she died and said she spoke to me. You know, she helped me with my father. She helped me with my husband. She helped me with my kid. You know, there she was in a room. There's 2,000 people. She found time to talk to people. She touched their lives. If you knew her, she was fearless and courageous. She challenged orthodoxy. She was intense. And, you know, if you want like little guidelines for how to run your life, and I do, and I think about her, she held a vision with intent. And for her, she would say, you know, your consciousness creates your reality. And if you hold it in your mind, it would happen. And I just look at Candace's life and the things that she's done. She just believed stuff so much that it would just happen. And I've witnessed that dozens and dozens of times. So, you know, if you have a passion, she would say, pursue your path. Just do not be deterred. Go after it. She was a visionary leader. She was decades ahead of her time. Her contributions haven't been fully realized. And I think her work continues, like in an organization like this, and for the people who have been inspired by her, who are thinking about this. And so her consciousness and spirit continues to exist among us. And I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about Candace and for coming here today. Thank you very much.